We finally have a Jubilee. She has been summoned and we have her hero preview. Thank goodness. Hi, I'm Villain Theory, and today we're talking about Jubilee, the latest hero revealed by Fantasy Flight Games for Marvel Champions. And in the preview, we saw almost all of her identity-specific cards, which is very, very interesting. So let's get into it. Long story short, her identity card is a little bit underwhelming. It's giving Hawkeye is kind of the nicest way I can say it, but it's not all bad. It's got some interesting stuff going on. Standard hand size in Alter Ego and Hero form, 5 and 6 respectively. Standard recovery stat of 3, fine, whatever. Now she does have the mutant trait in Alter Ego and X-Men in Hero form, which is of course really, really good. It's what we expected, but nonetheless very powerful. She has this Mole Rat action in Alter Ego, which lets her search her deck for the Shopping Spree player side scheme, which is one of her signature cards, and she has one copy, I should say, as well, and then put it into play. Since you have to search your deck for it, once you've done this once, you're kind of stuck until the next deck cycle, unless you're running Mutant Education, but generally, you're going to do this on turn 1 and try and get some sort of benefit that you've pre-planned. We'll talk more about that side scheme in a second, but overall, this is not an amazing ability, but it's pretty good, and it has some interesting implications for multiplayer because of a side scheme, which again, we'll talk about very, very soon. On the hero side, she's got a forwarding stat of 1, attack of 1, defense of 2. Not what I expected for a hero whose superpower is explosive energy, but hey, we've seen characters like this before do pretty well, such as Nova, so it's not the end of the world, but her hero ability it's good and bad. It is called a like totally, and it is a resource ability. Resource is better than 1 forwarding, 1 attack, or 1 defense, I would say, in most circumstances, almost all of them, to be honest, except you really need like an emergency 1 threat move or to get rid of a hazard icon side scheme, etc, etc. So a lot of the time on Jubilee, especially in the early game, you're going to be generating a resource by exhausting her, and that is going to help you set up upgrades and things quicker, things like that. Her events in particular and her, but unfortunately, having to exhaust to get the resource isn't so good. Normally, a hero can exhaust to get good benefit, and then they have an ability on their hero card that helps them in some other capacity, whereas Jubilee just doesn't have that. So that's a little bit unfortunate. She's got that 9 hit points, so she's extremely fragile. She does have a lot of stuns in her kit, which we will look at shortly, but any extra attacks from the encounter cards and things like that, anything with overkill, any stalwart enemies, she is going to be in trouble. And yeah, that's a little bit of a downside, but not the worst thing. The hit point characters can still do very, very well. So let's look at that player side scheme, and that is Shopping Spree. Only has 2 threat on it, does not scale per person, but threat cannot be removed from this scheme by heroes or allies. So like we're kind of with Cable's player side scheme, it has some kind of interesting restriction on who can or what can forward it. In this case, supports can forward it, and Alter Ego kind of events can forward it as well. But fortunately, it has an Alter Ego action built into it. You can exhaust your identity to remove 1 threat from it. And what makes this particularly interesting is that any player may trigger this ability. So this card says, when defeated, the player who defeated this side scheme searches their deck and discard pile for an item card and puts it into play. Now, she has 2 good item upgrades, but their benefits only work if you're in hero form. And this has interesting implications for your sequencing early on. In solo play, you're probably going to use your Alter Ego action on your Alter Ego card to bring Shopping Spree into play, then use the Alter Ego action on a Shopping Spree to remove half the threat, and then on a regular character, you'll just go to hero form. The problem is, if you go to hero form, get past the villain phase, and then on your following turn, go back to Alter Ego, to use this Alter Ego action again, yes, you will then defeat it, then you'll get one of her good items, but because they have hero responses, you cannot get their benefits that turn. This means Jubilee might want to stay Alter Ego for the first 2 turns of any given game, and I think that's really interesting. So Alter Ego action to get the side scheme, Alter Ego action to forward it, and then since you're exhausted from doing that, you're not really missing out on your hero activation. Stay Alter Ego for next turn, get an extra card from your Alter Ego hand size, then use the Alter Ego action on here to defeat it, get your upgrade item that has a hero response, then go to hero form and trigger its hero response to benefit from it then. So you're getting +1 cards for your trouble, you're getting an upgrade you can actually immediately use on the second turn here, and it absolutely is worth it because they are A, good items, but B, it is worth more than exhausting twice normally. But the downside is the villain is now scheming instead of attacking for that first turn. So it's kind of a little bit like you're playing Iron Man in that regard, which is interesting. But I think in most cases where you can get away with doing that, this is going to be the optimal route in solo play. Now for multiplayer, someone else can exhaust to remove 1 threat from it, then you can exhaust to remove it, get one of your items, or vice versa. You can exhaust first to get rid of a threat from it, then somebody else can exhaust, remove the last threat, get an item of theirs instead, which could be very, very powerful. Now, because the action to bring this in, it's an action, you can do this on other players' turns. You can make this work in any way you want. Now, I think this will determine some of her best pairings in multiplayer, because there are some really good items other people have. Aspect cards, not so many good items, but hero cards, I put Iceman's Power Belt in here just because it's a new card that's interesting. But we have Iron Man's Arc Reactor, Doctor Strange's Cloak of Levitation, Storm's Cape, all these very, very powerful items they love to get out as soon as they can. And you can make that happen by being Jubilee. Now, let's talk about Jubilee overall. And she is very much an event-driven hero. She's very much in the same kind of category as Gamora and Ms. Marvel. And looking at the cards they've shown us, counting the numbers they have, we can kind of see that the only card we're missing here is number 12, which looks to be another event. She has, I think, 8 events, 3 resource cards to, power those events. Then she has 2 upgrades which interact with those events, and a player side scheme to get the upgrades which interact with her events. Long story short, she definitely loves her events. We can also see that she's got 10A, 10B, and 10C on Plasmoid Energy. This is the same card, but the resource icons in the corner are different. This will probably be the same for Flash of Light and Firecracker. So let's take a look at Plasmoid Energy. And we can see that they are double resources. They're very, very good to have in general, but they're particularly good for Jubilee because her events want you to pay with different resources, and her upgrades like it when you've paid for those events with different resources, which is why they exist like this. This is pretty strong for her, but I do want to point out it's quite reminiscent of kind of Bishop and Magic in a way. Definitely the designs this wave have been very much inspired by resource interaction. We can see Bishop's cards here on the left. Stored Energy is an exact kind of copy of Plasmoid Energy in the middle here. Concussive Blast is an event which likes you to pay with a resource card, and we'll see Jubilee's events don't need to be paid for with resource cards specifically. They do like different resources, which you will get from these resource cards. And then we have Exorcism on the right here, and some of you guys might not have seen this card. This was actually revealed by a friend of the channel, Get Up and Game, on his channel. This was sent from Fantasy Flight Games officially, and what an interesting card for Magic it is. I could talk about it a lot already. Very strong card, but this card cares about the type of resource on top of her deck. Jubilee's cards care about the type of resources you pay with from your hand, so that's pretty interesting. So her first event is Firecracker. It's a 2-cost attack event, and it deals 4 damage to an enemy. If you paid with different resources, it will also stun that enemy. A bit reminiscent of Tackle or Dropkick. It's a little bit reminiscent of Spider-Man Miles Morales' card, and so is the next event. Flash of Light, 2-cost forwarding event, and it removes 3 threat from a scheme. If you paid with different resources, it also confuses an enemy. Then we have Blinding Flash, which is a 3-cost event, only 1 copy of it. Hero action, choose X enemies, where X is the number of different resources used to pay for this card. Now, note you cannot overpay for this card to get the benefits. It's a bit like Moon Girl, they put a ruling out for her. If you pay over the cost, it's not paying for it, it's overpaying, which is kind of considered separate. It's a little bit weird, but long story short, this will have a maximum target of 3 enemies. And then you get to stun and confuse those chosen enemies, which is potentially very good. In multi-villain scenarios, that's excellent. If you've got a bunch of minions out you haven't quite been able to handle, yeah, stun and confuse a villain. Why not stun and confuse a couple of those minions as well? But in a lot of scenarios, you'll just have the villain out. You might not have found any minions. The board will be kind of clean. This is still playable, just affecting the villain. Even if it's not the best value ever, still pretty decent in all honesty. So this is a pretty good card, unless the enemy is stalwart, which is, as you see, the problem Jubilee faces in general here. But nonetheless, I really like it. I like the art on Blinding Flash. I think that's pretty funny. Kind of forgot to talk about the art so far. I don't really like her hero card art. I'm kind of okay with the rest of it. I kind of like the 90s kind of feeling. I like the kind of the colorfulness of it, and it's very comic booky, which I enjoy. Then we have her upgrades that we've been talking about, these items I've alluded to that she can find with Shopping Spree. I think these are both really, really good cards, but they are unreliable in the sense that you need the corresponding event in hand to get any benefit from them. So one of them rewards you when you play attack events, one rewards you when you play forwarding events, but if you don't have one or either of those and you've got these out on the board, you're not getting the value you might otherwise get if these were static bonuses that didn't require you to play those certain types of event. Fortunately, again, Jubilee does have a lot of those events, and you're probably going to build her decks around them. So the sunglasses, 2-cost upgrade, Jubilee gets +1 attack. Now, her attack starts at 1. She can only exhaust to generate a wild resource, which is still kind of equivalent to 2 attack, I would say. I'm just going to help her play her events more, which she's all about. So boosting her attack is a little bit weird here, and we'll actually see with Jubilee's coat, which is another 2-cost upgrade item. She gets +1 falling. Yeah, it's kind of weird. You're kind of boosting up her stats to kind of equal the ability she's already got. It's going to give you some more flexibility in choice, but not a huge benefit here, although getting reliable forwarding with the coat, yeah, it's kind of good. But it's really the hero responses which you're paying for, which you want. So with the sunglasses, hero response, attack. After you play an attack event, exhaust the sunglasses and choose an enemy. deal 1 damage to that enemy for each different type of resource you use to pay for that event. So if you play a free cost attack event and you pay for it with a mental, energy, and physical resource, then you get a bonus free damage that you can put somewhere else by using the sunglasses. Now, I'm not quite sure how her sunglasses help her attack another target, but I do like the art on this card a lot, and I do like the effect on this card a lot. If you can pay with a different resource up to the cost of a card, this is a little bit like Hone Technique. You do have to exhaust it, but it doesn't have to be an aggression card. You can use this on her signature card. You know, you can use this on Firecracker for potentially 2 extra damage. We could use it on Full Body Charge, which is a new attack card coming with magic, to get 4 extra damage if we can find a Strength, Energy, Genius, and Wild resource to pay for it. So potentially getting anywhere between 1 to 4 damage depending on the cost of the card you're paying for. I think it's going to often be 2 to 3 damage. I think that's very, very good. The coat is the exact same, but it's forwarding and it needs a forward event, and that removes 1 threat for each different resource paid for a threat removal event. So again, with Flash of Light, her signature card, you can get 2 extra forwarding from Jubilee's coat every time you do this, and these can go anywhere. They are not attached to the enemy or scheme you previously attacked or forwarded, so I think that's very, very good. I think she'll probably, depending on her build, prefer one or the other of these, but in a lot of cases, especially solo and 2-player, she's going to really want to prioritize getting both of these out for full value. Although, again, solo, I should actually say, she's prone to have too much threat removal here. If you use a threat removal event and then get 2 to 3 extra threat removal, yeah, in solo, won't always have a home to put that actual threat removal. So the benefits there are a little bit more murky and nebulous to its true value. But damage always has a place to go. So these kind of remind me of Ironheart's upgrade. So she can get an upgrade that does damage every turn and removes threat every turn, but they're not reliant on playing events. They're just there to use every turn, but they scale with her version number, which is kind of interesting. And it also has a boost to her base stats that's not that important, but it's kind of nice to have as well. So that reminds me of that a little bit. And they also remind me of Miss Marvel's upgrades, Shrink and Embiggen, which want you to play an attack event and then fort event as well, kind of every turn to get the benefit from them if they're out on the board. And as I mentioned, like I say, Jubilee in general really reminds me of Gamora and Miss Marvel, very event-based. Now, we also have Wolverine, which is her signature ally. It doesn't really synergize with her whatsoever. It does have a wild resource. Actually, a few of the cards we looked at have wild resources, so pretty useful for her to find these different resources to pay for her cards with. But as an ally, Wolverine is very good. He's about as good as the aggression Wolverine. I would say maybe slightly better in some circumstances, slightly worse in others. But yeah, Wolverine, free attack, piercing, 4 HP, 4 cost, everything you've already seen in the normal aggression Wolverine ally. Difference is the healing. Wolverine in aggression will heal once after your turn begins every single turn. Wolverine with Jubilee doesn't heal until you go Ultra Ego, but then it's a big burst of healing. It's more healing overall, but it is reliant on you going Ultra Ego, which, especially in solo, can be risky, but she does have a lot of confusers, so it's going to be very usable for her, and I generally think is a very good signature ally. And then we have Unlikely Duo, which is a team-up event with Wolverine. 2 cost, it's an attack, so it will work with her sunglasses. Also works through Wolverine's claws if you're playing Wolverine, and it confuses an enemy, deals 4 damage to them. So very reminiscent of her actual events, and works slightly better with Float Like a Butterfly, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But generally, since Wolverine's sticking around for a while, this is a pretty good team-up event to have. Overall, I think her events, when you pay for them with different resources, which you should be able to do every time since her, hero ability is to generate a wild resource, worst case, but you'll probably have the cards in hand to some capacity or her own resource cards. They punch a little bit above their weight. They're pretty good. But if you can't pay for them with 2 different resource types, they're a little bit weak. If the enemy is stalwart, they're a little bit weak. So it's a bit unfortunate. Combined with her identity card being a little bit weak, overall, Thanos maybe not her best matchup, let's put it that way. But overall, I think the strength of her hero cards, getting all the stun and confuse out, getting those double resources, I think overall a little bit better than average, which puts Jubilee in a pretty good spot overall so far. Now let's look at how she interacts with the deck building cards in the game and what she might like. So I mentioned that she might have too much threat removal for solo play, but this is when player side schemes come in and giving you targets for that threat removal. So I think she's going to combo really well with side schemes in general. I don't think there's any one in particular that stands out as incredibly amazing for her compared to, most characters, although, she does have a 4-cost signature ally, so Cool Backup might be nice there, but she will just like places to put her threat removal and then get benefits beyond, her own player side scheme, which you cannot afford in hero form. So I think the player side schemes will be good in a general sense. Then we have the resource cards. Since you want to pay with different resource types, power of aggression, power of protection, all that kind of thing, be able to generate wild resources is very good. If you play an aggression attack event and it costs 2 or more, you can choose the wilds on power of aggression to be different resources. So immediately you're going to be able to trigger extra damage from her sunglasses, things like that. that's going to be very good for her. So she'll definitely like these in general if you build into them. Then we've got the normal double resources, and I don't know if she wants these. I think some decks yes, some decks no. If you play one of her signature events, she wants you to use different resources, right, to get the extra stun or confuse effect, and you cannot do that if you pay for it with one of the normal doubles. But even if you're playing a regular aspect event, you still can get benefits for using different resources on it from your upgrades, such as your sunglasses and coat. So not too desirable in really event-heavy decks, I would say. If you're planning to play 2 different events at least every turn, you might not have anywhere you really want to use these, but maybe if you're going for more of an ally-based thing, you might want to use them more. And she definitely has some builds she can do around that, particularly because there are now 2 cards which exist, which anyone can take in any aspect, that are attacking and forwarding all in one. And we're going to look at those very shortly. So we have then X-Gene and Death Focus if we're talking about resources and resource generators. And Death Focus is, you would think, good for her because she has a lot of superpowers, but since it reduces the cost of those cards, you cannot then pay for them with more different resource types, so actually you do not want Death Focus whatsoever. X-Gene, however, is almost made for her. It exhausts for a wild resource, which can be any kind of resource, so it's just perfect to hit those different resource types. Then X-Jet's going to be really good for her, looking at all the basic cards now. Utopia will ready her up to exhaust again to be another wild resource, so that's kind of interesting. And then we also have the cards like Enhanced Reflexes, which generate a specific resource type. That might be kind of interesting for her, in all honesty. Not really confident she'll want them since X-Jet and X-Gene exist, so, you know, it's not essential, but still pretty interesting. I'm definitely going to be experimenting with that. Then we have the events I was talking about. Hit and Run has existed for a while. It was repackaged in Gambit. The original version came with Gamora, and it's an attack and fort all in one. So you can pay for this free cost event with 3 different resource types, and then trigger your sunglasses for 3 damage, and then trigger your coat for 3 extra threat removal. So while it's only 2 damage to an enemy and 2 threat from a scheme for the card itself, if you play this with your upgrades in play, you can actually get 5 damage and 5 threat removal, which is really actually very good. A new card she comes with is Multi-Talented, which is basically an upgraded version of Hit and Run. There's no way around that. If you're playing Jubilee in an aspect that doesn't have a lot of good forwarding cards with a good amount of cost on them to get benefits from her coat, you might be using this. I fully expect to see Multi-Talented, honestly, in a bunch of aggression, protection, and leadership decks for her. We'll see how that goes, and as the card pool expands, there will be more, forwarding cards presumably in those aspects as well that she might prefer instead. But generally, I think Multi-Talented is going to be a very good card for a lot of Jubilee's decks. And then we have Mutant Education as one other basic card I want to talk about. It doesn't really correspond to these ones, but you can use Mutant Education to shuffle her own hero cards back into her deck, so you can get more benefits from her own identity events, but also you can put Shopping Spree back into your deck, so when you Ultra Ego, you can use your action to get it again, and potentially again, and start getting items for you and other players more regularly, which I think is really, really fun. So that about does it for the basic cards. I really think Multi-Talented is pretty good for her, in all honesty, especially in certain aspects. So I think that's probably the biggest surprise you guys will see here. And also that maybe she doesn't want the double basic resources all the time. And then let's move on to leadership, and no prizes for guessing that an X-Men character likes Uncanny X-Men. The support card is just so incredibly good. Let's say you play an X-Men ally with this card for cheap, then you can play something like Multi-Talented or Hit and Run, trigger all your upgrades, and you've had a really good turn, in all honesty. I think that's going to be a good kind of, gameplay loop, kind of a good flow to try and aim for on your turns with that kind of deck. So yeah, Uncanny X-Men, as usual, very good for X-Men characters. But a little bit more specifically interesting for Jubilee would be Beast. Beast gets you a resource card, which is really good when you're looking for different resources for your events. But if you have Band Together in your deck, then you're getting all those wilds. You're getting especially a good resource for all your event cards. Rapid Response to get Beast more than once, repeatedly get him back into play for cheap is extremely good. So this kind of combo that you might also see somewhere like on Ironheart or something is very, very useful. Then we have Strength in Numbers. If we want Band Together, we might like Strength in Numbers, and we can potentially afford to keep out quite a few allies, more than you would expect on a 9 hit point hero, because we have all those status cards. So in solo play, we can actually probably build up So a lot of the time in solo play, we can probably build up a pretty good board. So I think that'll be really interesting. That's going to help you dig into your deck, find those events to reliably trigger your upgrades. Kalu, if you're not running an X-Men deck, you'll be able to play him, search your deck for a certain event card you want. I need a top 5, but she's going to have a lot of events anyway, so it's going to have a very good success rate in finding you something you want. And of course, as someone who likes different resources, Clarity of Purpose, getting you a wild resource and being a very cheap card in general, is going to be very good, although with her low hit points, a little bit riskier than the average hero, but not too big of a deal. So then I need to talk about Adam Warlock, who, because she has 3 different resource cards with 2 different resource icons on them, he's kind of interesting with her. Now, I think the kind of puzzle of getting him into play, then getting those resource cards, and then being able to make them the last card in your hand, you haven't spent them on anything else. Don't think that's super easy or even super desirable for her, because she probably does want to use them to help play certain events and things, but pretty interesting, kind of good numbers if you use them with Adam Warlock. Nothing exceptional, because you're kind of losing a double resource you could have spent as a double resource on something else as well, so it's kind of costing you more resources than you might expect overall. But yeah, it's pretty usable. If you heal Adam, that conversion rate gets better. So interesting. I don't think it'll go in too many of her decks, but I do think people will like exploring this because it's interesting. Then we have the attack cards in leadership, and we also have the forwarding cards as well. You might think those are going to be good for her because she has those upgrades which want you to play attack and forwarding cards, but I just don't think they're that good, really. They kind of use her stats, which are terrible until you've got your upgrades, but then they're kind of just average, and I don't think they're worth the trouble. I really think hit and run and multi-talented are going to be better, multi-talented especially, but there might be some exceptions with mass attack with an X-Men build, but it's not really doing that much for me, in all honesty. So overall, I think when I'm playing Jubilee in leadership, I'm probably looking at an Uncanny X-Men deck, as usual for most X-Men characters, but also strength in numbers, which again is useful and very powerful on most heroes. But with her stuns and her wanting to go Ultra Ego and then use Confuses up, she can build that ally board, and then, band together is really good for her as well. So I think that's going to work really, really well. Next up, we have Aggression, and I just want to shout out a couple of the X-Men allies, which actually benefit from having a certain resource. She's always going to have that resource type available because of her wild resource thing on her hero card again. So kind of interesting that she is especially good with these allies. But overall, it's looking like Hone Technique is going to be very, very good for Jubilee, just because she wants to play kind of expensive cards anyway to benefit from her sunglasses. So if you play Full Body Charge normally, which is a new card coming with Magic, it's 8 damage. You play it with Hone Technique, that's 12 damage. If you have the sunglasses in play and get the full benefit, you then get to deal an additional 4 damage afterwards, which is 16 damage total, which is kind of absurd. But Hone Technique also goes well with plenty of other attack events in the game. The one I like the most is probably going to be Clobber. I just love that this is a 2-cost event, that if Jubilee plays it with her sunglasses and with Hone Technique, it's going to be 7 damage total. 3 for Clobber, 2 for the sunglasses, 2 for Hone Technique, and if it's the first thing you play this turn, it will bounce back to your hand. So you've effectively played a 1-cost attack event and got 7 damage, which to me is very, very fun. Martial Prowess will help to pay for all the attacks you're doing. Press the Advantage will kind of combo all the stuns and confuse you have, but not super worried about that. Clobber, Hone Technique in general with some of these big attacks, going to be a lot of fun. You can melee to deal 3 damage and 3 damage, and with your sunglasses deal another 3 damage. It's just going to be a good time if you want to clear minions. So overall in Aggression, it's just Hone Technique that I'm really looking at. Maybe even too much damage for solo play. I'm not really sure. I don't normally use Hone Technique too much in solo play. I think it shines much, much brighter in 2 to 4 player, but definitely 2 to 4 player. If I'm playing Aggression Jubilee, I am definitely taking Hone Technique. Also worth mentioning, the mentors to even get this in play is something that Jubilee can also get very easily, thanks to the extra wild on that hero card ability again. So very consistent. Then I'm going to talk about Protection, and it actually has a few interesting attack events. Hard Knocks, dealing 4 damage, pay for it with different resources, have your sunglasses. Now it's 7 damage, but it's going to be 3 damage afterwards somewhere. So that extra 3 damage does not help you trigger the tough card, but she will definitely like the tough card with that low hit points she has. Tackle, being a 3-cost card again, 3 extra damage from your sunglasses, that's really good. Helps you keep the enemy super stun locked, could be very, very useful. Although possibly too much stun in combination with those signature cards she has. She has 3 Firecrackers, 1 Blinding Flash, so she already has 4 stuns in her deck. Momentum Shift, kind of interesting. She will have to take damage, but it's kind of a useful attack event to have. So it could be interesting. I don't know if I'm running Momentum Shift though over multi-talented. Then we have Taunt, and this is maybe a little bit strange, but hey, Jubilee is on the art, and I would say for a reason. The interesting thing here is, if you have Tackle in your deck, and you have, those 3 Firecrackers, normally that might be too much stun. Not always, but it could happen. Well, if you have Taunt in your hand, you can consume one of those stuns on the attack that Taunt generates, get some cards, and then play another card with a stun on it. So that's kind of interesting. I think that could be useful, especially if you're digging for a forwarding event to combo with her coat. But maybe not a main strategy, but I think it'll be very fun. Energy Barrier is interesting purely because it is one of the very, very few aspect cards which has the item trait on it, and surely the best one. I don't think her stats and really kind of game plan lend itself to repurposed too much. I don't think she'll like that generally, but being a low hit point hero and this being an item, Energy Barrier might still be pretty good for her. It's a pretty good card in general, even if you're not repurposing it. I sometimes forget that it's really very good. Then we have Brother Voodoo, who's a bit like Kalu. He can search your top 5 cards for an event, which Jubilee will obviously like. So that about does it for protection. Not too much going on with it. I don't think in multiplayer I'd be looking to play it with her unless I'm going very ally heavy, because the X-Men allies are very good in protection. But generally, I'm probably looking at that stun, lock, taunt kind of combo for a solo play, probably. But yeah, probably I would say her worst aspect is my initial impression. Then we have Justice, which is probably going to be her best aspect. She comes with this new card Waylay, which can deal up to 7 damage. With Jubilee, with her sunglasses, that's potentially 10 damage. That's kind of honed technique in Justice for you in a way. Obviously, you have to exhaust sunglasses, so on and so forth. Very, very good, I think. This card, otherwise, maybe not the best. It definitely has a hero response, which is a little bit fiddly to get. You need to remove the last threat from a scheme to get full value, but I still think this will see a lot of use in her. Stealth Strike looks really good for Jubilee as well. With those sunglasses, this is potentially getting you 7 damage overall, as well as 2 threat removal, so I really like that. But then we have Float Like a Butterfly. Her sunglasses deal damage separately to the attack card you play, and they count as an attack. So if I play Stealth Strike and the target is confused, Stealth Strike is dealing 5 damage. If I then use the damage from her sunglasses and the enemy is also confused, that is going to deal a +1 damage, so I could be dealing 4 damage. So I could turn Stealth Strike here with the sunglasses out and Float Like a Butterfly, potentially going to do 9 damage for me, and Waylay is going to make it up to 12 damage, which is kind of absurd. So you're going to have a lot of kill power, taking out villains, if you are playing Float Like a Butterfly in Jubilee. And then we have the threat removal cards, kind of the corresponding. Even the Odds is probably the best 4-player threat removal card in the game. It has an energy requirement. Guess who has a wild resource every single turn? It's Jubilee, so that's going to be very good for her. And she'll get 2 extra threat removal from her coat. 3 Steps Ahead is a new card. Already wants different resource types, so it's no inconvenience to Jubilee. And that's going to get her potentially 3 extra threat removal from her coat. So that's very, very good. Sense of Justice is going to help pay for that. Very, very good. Then we have Disguise, which is a new card as well, and this is a bit of a weird card that just exhausts your identity for 2 threat removal. Most characters can just do that anyway with their hero form, but this can happen in Alter Ego, and since it can happen in Alter Ego, this can help with Shopping Spree. So you can go in disguise to the mall to go shopping, and kind of interesting. We then have Surveillance Team, which can remove threat from that Shopping Spree player side scheme as well, since it's a support card, which is kind of interesting, although I don't really think she wants to build into shield, but I thought that was worth mentioning as well. What I do think she wants is more targets for her threat removal, particularly in solo play, which is where one way or another comes in, and that's just a really good card in general. So side scheme Jubilee is looking very, very good, and since she has that player side scheme as well, she can get out all these cards like Chance Encounter and Followed become very, very consistent. If you have Mutant Education, shuffling Shopping Spree back into your deck, whenever you go Alter Ego, you can kind of guarantee a player side scheme, which means these cards are just super, super consistent for her. So overall for Justice, I'm looking at Float Like a Butterfly or kind of a side team focus, but I also think the attack and thought events are very, very good for her here. I think they are the best mix of all the aspects of all the cards we have seen so far. Aggression has loads of good attack events, but not really good thought events for her. Protection, again, quite a few attacks, no real thought events she's going to really want in my opinion. And then Leadership, again, has a couple of attack and thought cards, but they're not really very good for her at all. Justice has good attack and good thwarting cards, so that's really nice. Then we have my predictions for her overall. Damage, pretty good. Those 3 attack events and the sunglasses upgrade, really good. Sunglasses working with aspect attacks, and a basic 1 multi-talented, which is pretty good. Yeah, her damage is going to be absolutely solid. Now, the problem is her signature event card, you really want to use it on the villain to get best value out of the stun. If you're using it to clear a minion, it's pretty undesirable, so I think that hurts it slightly and is worth a mention, but still, damage output is going to be pretty good for Jubilee. Thwarting is also going to be pretty good for the exact same reasons. 3 threat removal events and an upgrade which works with any kind of threat removal for even more threat removal is going to be really nice. There will be some circumstances where she gets a bit unlucky with where her signature thwarting cards are, but again, those where multi-talented is going to come in really useful, or any good threat removal card in Justice. So she is going to have a pretty good thwarting output constantly, especially once that upgrade is in play. Survivability is a really interesting topic for her. 9 hit points, 2 defense would put that quite low, but she has all these stuns and confuses, which is going to kind of put it kind of high. But extra encounter cards are going to be risky for her. Any steady enemy is going to be a little bit trickier for her. Any stalwart enemy is going to be a major, major threat. So survivability was a little bit hard to mark here. Honestly, If we're talking stalwart enemies, that control stat, which we're going to look at shortly, drops all the way down, and so does her card value. So good against non-stalwart, terrible against stalwart. There aren't a ton of stalwart enemies, but there are cards which bring it in on a few characters and temporarily gain it or gain it in the later stages is something we've seen recently too. So something to be aware of and kind of careful of if you're picking Jubilee. Now, with a resource ability printed on her hero card and 3 double resource cards just in her deck by default, I think her economy is actually really strong. But I don't know if you're going to be running to run those doubles in every deck, Strength, Energy, and Genius. So actually, I don't know if she's going to have a lot more resources than you would normally have or not. So I could put this at 5, I put it at 4, and we'll have to see how that shakes out. Speed of setup, I actually think is pretty good. If you do that strategy of getting her player side scheme turn 1, staying Alter Ego, you can get that setup card and use it on turn 2 guaranteed. And she doesn't really need a ton of setup, in my opinion. She will like resource generators, she will like card draw, but everyone kind of does. So I think she's going to be ready to go pretty quick. Not as quick as someone like Nova, but nonetheless, you're going to find her very helpful in the early game if you're playing multiplayer as a slow setup character. Her reliability is kind of hurt by the fact that she's an event-driven character. You might not find the right event to trigger her upgrades. You might not find the right event to just deal with what you need to. And then you have 1 fort and 1 attack, and you're like, oh, now I've got to deal with this. You can't trigger your upgrades to help you. You've got nothing. So I think that hurts her. Then we have card value, and this was a difficult one to rank because if we're talking about her identity card, it's probably on the lower side. If we're talking about her other cards, it's probably 4 or 5 stars. So definitely kind of conflict going on there. But against steady enemies, value drops. Against stalwart enemies, it just plummets. So it's kind of interesting in that way. Ease of play, I put at 4. I think she's pretty straightforward. I think you're going to want to play an attack and a forwarding event. You're going to want to get your upgrades in play, and different resources are not going to be too difficult to manage because it's not asking for specific resources, just different resources. So any old combination will do. So can honestly be a fairly decent character for a newer player, although the player side scheme that she starts with might be a little bit confusing if it's their very first time playing the game. But 3rd or 4th time playing the game, Jubilee is going to be very, very easy to kind of pick up and get the hang of, in my opinion. Then I put variety down at 2, and this is a tricky one. I almost put it at 3, but I think justice stands out way above the other aspects, but I think leadership is actually closer than some people would expect. Protection, I don't really like at all for her, and I think it'll be fine. I think it will be, viable, but I think it will just be notably lesser than the other 3. So that's kind of a little hurt to the variety, in my opinion, that she's kind of deterred from one aspect and really drawn to another in particular. But I also don't think there's a ton of different builds for her. Some characters I'm seeing 3 or 4 different avenues in every aspect. For Jubilee, it was more like 1 or 2, maybe 3 being generous. But, when I looked at Justice, there are a lot of combinations, a lot of ways you can hybrid those concepts in the first place, and you might want to. So I'm just not convinced she can have a ton of different deck types to give you that variety if you play her repeatedly. Now, this is an interesting one because in many ways, she looks pretty weak, and I've heard people in the community say, yeah, she doesn't look that strong, but I put quite a good amount of stars here, and I'd be curious in the comments if you disagree with any of these. Obviously, Stalwart is going to lower several of them, but in general, I think her damage looks good. I think her forwarding looks good. I think with all that stun and confuse, Expert 2, Standard 2 is going to be a bit more dangerous, but generally, I think her survivability is going to be pretty good for a 9 hit point character, in all honesty. 2 defense is still usable, and that has led me to put her in B tier, and there's an asterisk if you're against a stalwart or even a steady enemy. I think that could drop down, and I wouldn't even be surprised if it heads up to the higher side of B, potentially. Just, having resources and stun and confuse is just good. Having the X-Men and mutant trait is just very good. But something that's different to when I did the Iceman review and also predicted B tier for him, and honestly also Bishop I predicted to be B tier, is that all the new characters we have in the X-Force wave that we now have completed, they're all scoring in mostly A and S tier, in my opinion, which is kind of pushing people down, and it's pushing strong heroes down. What I would consider my B tier in the modern state of the game is a lot stronger than, let's say, 2 years ago, put it that way. It's immensely stronger. So B tier actually pretty strong, and I think Jubilee's going to surprise people who don't expect much from her. I think turn 1 could be a little, tricky. Turn 2 onwards, I think she's going to really be a hard-hitting hero who can pay for a lot and do a lot of things. And that about does the video. So let me know what you think. Am I wrong here? Have I convinced you? How are you feeling about Jubilee overall? What do you think about the art? Let me know. If you want to hop in a discussion on Discord, I do have a server for the channel, link in the description. And if you enjoyed the video and made it this far, please go ahead and shoot some fireworks at the subscribe button, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye.